It was only 9 p.m. on Black Friday, and I was feeling triumphant. After hours of battling through relentless crowds, I'd finally snagged one of the last gaming consoles on the shelves, a rare prize in the frenzied atmosphere of the day. As I made my way across the dimly lit parking lot towards my car, clutching my hard-won reward, I felt a surge of pride. The fluorescent lights of the store faded behind me, leaving only the weak, flickering overhead lamps casting long shadows across the asphalt. The parking lot was nearly empty, adding a strange quietness that felt both freeing and eerie. As I got closer to my car, two figures emerged from the shadows, blocking my path. My heart pounded as they stepped into the faint light, revealing their faces partly hidden by dark hoodies. Both men were large, built like they could bench press my weight twice over.
"Hold it right there,"
one of them growled, his voice low and commanding.
"That console you got there, hand it over."
I stopped dead, clutching the box tighter to my chest. "What? No way, this is mine," I stammered, a mix of shock and defiance in my voice. The second man stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating.
"We weren't asking, pal. Hand it over, you're gonna regret it."
I looked around, hoping to spot someone, anyone who might help, but the lot was empty. The only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead lights. My mind raced, frantically searching for a way out. I felt a shiver of fear run through me, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Look, please, this is a Christmas gift for my son," I said, forcing the words out as my hands gripped the console box tighter. The first man snorted.
"Yeah? Well, it's not gonna mean much to him when we pawn it off."
He reached out, his hand brushing against the box as he tried to pull it from my grip. Panic surged. I twisted, pulling the console out of his reach, but he stepped closer, and we began struggling over it, yanking it back and forth. Then, out of nowhere, the second man threw a punch that connected with the side of my head, sending stars across my vision. I stumbled, feeling the box slip from my grip as my legs went weak. The console hit the ground, and in an instant, the two men scooped it up, their triumphant smirks visible even in the dim light. They exchanged a glance, looking satisfied.
"Thanks, pal,"
the first man sneered, his voice dripping with mockery as he and his partner turned and jogged off into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. I stood there, dazed, my head pounding and my chest tight with frustration and helplessness. Every part of me wanted to chase after them, to shout, to do anything. But my legs felt rooted to the spot. The sense of defeat washed over me as I watched my son's Christmas gift disappear into the night. Finally, I stumbled to my car, fumbling for my phone with trembling hands. I dialed 911, my voice shaky as I reported the robbery. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could sense the sympathy behind her tone. "We'll send a car right away, sir," she said gently. "Can you describe the assailants?" I tried, but my memories felt jumbled and hazy. All I could recall were their hulking figures, the flash of their hoodies, and the cruel glint in their eyes as they walked away with the console. When the police arrived, they were understanding but realistic.
"Without clear surveillance or other witnesses, it'll be tough to track them down,"
the officer said, his face kind but serious.
"I'm sorry this happened. Unfortunately, Black Friday can bring out the worst in people, especially in isolated spots like this. Try not to shop alone at night if you can help it."
I nodded numbly, my mind still reeling from the assault. The officer left, and I sank into the driver's seat, letting the weight of the experience settle in. I'd always prided myself on being careful, on staying vigilant. But tonight, it hadn't mattered. Those men had been waiting, lurking like predators in the dark, and I'd been an easy target. As I drove home, waves of anger and disbelief crashed over me. How could a night meant for holiday shopping end in violence and theft? I replayed the scene in my head, haunted by the realization that my best hadn't been enough. My son's Christmas gift was gone, taken by people who cared nothing for the impact of their actions. I knew I'd never feel quite the same in a parking lot at night, and every time I thought back to that Black Friday, a part of me would remember those faces in the dark. Their cold smiles, their ruthless intent, and the helplessness that had overtaken me in those last moments. It was a memory I would carry with me long after that season had passed. It was the launch day of the PlayStation 2, and I was working my first Black Friday shift as a seasonal employee at Best Buy. Fresh out of college and eager to make some cash, I didn't realize what I was in for. The line had started forming days earlier, with die-hard gamers camping out in the freezing cold to secure a chance at this exclusive console. By the time dawn broke, the line had swollen to over 100, all angling for a spot near the doors. When the doors finally opened, the crowd poured in, elbows flying and carts clanging, all eyes locked on the electronics section. My task was simple but high stakes: distribute the limited PS2 units to customers who had vouchers. Only those with vouchers were guaranteed a console, and I clutched 2 of them tightly as I moved through the crowd. The tension in the air was palpable as I reached the front of the line, trying to hold steady as people clamored around me, faces twisted with determination, hands outstretched. I was scanning for a woman waving her voucher when a man in his 40s stepped forward, blocking my path. His gaze dropped to the console in my arms, and I saw a glint of something unnerving in his eyes. "Just hand it over," he said flatly, extending his hand. "I've been waiting here long enough." "Your voucher, sir?" I replied, keeping my voice steady as I pulled the console closer. His face hardened. "I don't have a damn voucher, and I don't need one. I was here before most of these people. It's mine." I explained the voucher system again, keeping calm, but his expression turned hostile, his fists clenched at his side. Behind him, a few other shoppers glanced over, sensing a standoff. "You're going to give it to me," he said, his voice low and seething, "or I'll just take it myself." I froze, feeling the weight of his threat hanging in the air. I glanced around, hoping for a manager nearby, but everyone was busy handling other parts of the chaos. I was on my own. "I can't do that, sir," I replied, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I'll have to call security if—" "Security?" He laughed, a bitter edge in his voice. "Over a console? You're just a kid. You don't get how this works." He stepped closer, his wife standing behind him with a silent look of approval, as if daring me to deny them. It was a moment of pure adrenaline, but something in me snapped. I was tired of being pushed around by customers acting like it was life or death over a product. "Listen," I said, standing my ground. "If you're so set on it, then let me clock out first. We can settle this outside." For a second, the man's bravado slipped. He looked taken aback, his eyes shifting as he sized me up. His wife tugged at his arm, hissing for him to back down, but he didn't budge. He stammered, clearly thrown off by my response. His eyes darted around, catching the attention of other shoppers who started watching. His chest puffed up again, but he only managed a half-hearted glare. "Yeah, that's what I thought," I said, my voice steady. "Now, are you going to let the people with vouchers through, or are we done here?" The man muttered something under his breath, but after another tug from his wife, he turned and stalked away, disappearing into the crowd. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my heart pounding, but feeling a rush of pride. I'd stood my ground. The rest of my shift went smoothly enough, with customers quietly filing through to claim their consoles. But the encounter left a bitter taste in my mouth. It was a reminder of how far people would go for something they wanted, even if it meant intimidating a young employee. As I clocked out that evening, I couldn't shake the man's expression from my mind, the way he'd been willing to escalate over something so trivial. It was a sobering glimpse into the darker side of human nature, a side that came alive on Black Friday. Years later, I'd look back on that day and feel grateful that I'd left retail behind. But the lesson I learned about people, their ability to push boundaries, to bully and threaten whenever they think they're entitled, stayed with me. And every Black Friday since, I've reminded myself to never underestimate what people are willing to do when they believe they deserve something. It was the night before Black Friday, and I found myself wandering the aisles of my local Walmart, picking up last-minute items. As I turned toward the grocery section, I saw something unexpected. Towers of tightly wrapped pallets piled high, covering the center of the store. Usually, Black Friday deals were kept securely in the stockroom until the big day, only to be brought out and guarded. But here they were, unguarded and practically begging to be claimed early. I raised an eyebrow, glancing around. Walmart had put the merchandise out early. I shook off any tempting thoughts, reminding myself that grabbing something now would only get me kicked out or worse. I collected the last few things I needed and headed toward the checkout, silently bracing myself for the chaos tomorrow would bring. The next morning, the Walmart parking lot was already packed. Dozens of shoppers pressed toward the store entrance, waiting for the doors to swing open. Some were shouting, some joking loudly, and others simply stood, eyes locked on the door with the determination of soldiers before a battle. When the doors opened, they flooded in, a stampede of bodies pushing, shoving, and yelling as they surged forward, filling the store with a cacophony of voices, carts clanging, and hurried footsteps. I hung back, watching the spectacle unfold. Near the center of the store, a commotion broke out around the pallets that had been sitting there since last night. I strained to see past the crowd, and what I saw chilled me. Shoppers were slicing through the plastic wrapping with box cutters, pulling out items like they were prized treasures. But something had gone wrong. In the middle of a crowd, a young employee was trying to stop them, his face tight with frustration. "Please, folks, step back!" he yelled, waving his hands. "We're not opening these until the clock hits 10, store policy!" But his voice was swallowed up by the noise around him, and the shoppers ignored him, some shouting profanities, others ripping the wrapping faster. One shopper, a man in his 50s with a look of sheer determination, turned his attention to the employee and muttered something I couldn't hear. Then, in a flash, things turned ugly. The man lunged at the employee, shoving him backwards. Others joined in, some still hacking away at the wrapping, others jostling to get closer. The young employee held up his hands defensively, but it was no use. The man from before swiped at him with his box cutter, catching his arm. Blood splattered across the tile floor. Gasps and screams erupted, people scattering backwards, their faces twisting in shock. The young employee staggered, catching his arm, his face a mask of pain. But instead of backing away, the man smirked and shoved him again. Time seemed to slow as I watched, paralyzed. The crowd was split between those frozen in horror and those who kept grabbing merchandise, unfazed by the bloodshed around them. One shopper, a woman with a small child, was pushing her way through, her eyes fixed on a discounted TV even as the young man struggled to keep his balance. The police sirens wailed in the distance, but the damage was already done. The injured employee was slumped against a display, his arm bleeding heavily, staining the floor. People still reached past him, grabbing at merchandise as though nothing had happened, stepping over the blood like it was just another obstacle. I forced myself to move, my heart pounding as I pushed my way out of the store, the horrific images seared into my mind. The news of the assault spread quickly, but most people shrugged it off, treating it as just another Black Friday horror story. But I knew what I'd seen. That crazed glint in their eyes, the ruthlessness with which they'd turned on someone who got in their way. It was a sobering reminder of just how far some people would go when given the chance, when faced with a few dollars worth of savings. I never went back to that Walmart. Even thinking about the place brought the memory back in vivid detail. The crimson-stained tiles, the shocked look on the young man's face, and the absolute disregard for human decency in that crowd. I wondered how many others had walked away from that day with the same haunting memory, or if they'd chalked it up to just another part of Black Friday madness. I only knew one thing. There was no deal in the world worth that kind of horror.